Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Ken Wims. This is the second part of our presentations on mostly on the avionics upgrade to the Mooneys. The one tonight's really was part of a presentation we had done for the avionics that were in the Warriors. But it's very applicable because it's using some of the same core components, primarily the GFC 500. So this is going to be that with a little bit of flavor towards the Mooneys, since there's a few things that are specific to the Mooneys that are a little different than the Warriors. And I'll try to point those out as we go along. If you have any questions as we're going along, you can unmute yourself and speak up, or you can send a chat, and Heinz is helping me here. He'll look at the chat and let me know that there's a question, and we'll try to get those answered for you as we go along. So with that in mind, we'll kind of get started with it. So we'll go through an outline here. Here's the first part of the outline. This is exactly what we had gone over last time. So I've marked some pieces off that I'm not going to go into. I am going to cover a few of the things a second time here, just to lay the groundwork for those that weren't here before. Then we'll focus more on the next part of it, which is dealing with the G5s, how it works as the PFD only, as the backup for the G3X Touch. We'll talk a bit more about doing the Garmin 750, because if you're not good with that, you're going to be very limited what you can get out of the GFC 500. We'll go over some items you want to check before you fly. We did that last time. I'm going to reiterate that tonight as well. Talk about the GMC 507 controller, which is a control head for the GFC 500. So then we'll go through the GFC 500, the pre-flight for it, the limitations associated with it, and some of these limitations are specific to the Mooney. We'll talk about the ESP mode. I got a video on that from Garmin. Then there's a video from Sporties that talks about autopilot in general. Then I'll go over some specific emergency procedures and some non-normal procedures for the GFC 500. Then we're going to go into 3 flight scenarios. And these flights are going to be done using the simulator that Heinz spearheaded putting together we have here at the club. These are going to be showing 2 G5s, GTN 650, and the GFC 507 controller, GMC 507 controller. That said, you can think of the G3X Touch as a big dual G5. And the 650 is just a small version of a 750. They operate very, very similar. So everything that's shown in here is going to be very applicable to what goes on, excuse me, in the Mooney with the 750 and the G3X Touch. I'll point out a few places that the simulator doesn't simulate things exactly right. So I'll try to make sure I point those out as we go along. So the first one, this was a Georgia request. What if I want to get up and fly this and I don't want to deal with the GPS at all? And so we're only going to use nav radios. We're just going to take off, fly to TTA, fly out and fly vector to final for the ILS Zulu 3 back here in the TTA and go miss on that. The next flight is using GPS for course guidance. Fly out and head out towards Liberty, intercepting a course going out that way. Then we're going to request and fly the full ILS Yankee 3. Approach back in here with a hold and little procedure turn. That's going to be strictly under control of the autopilot. All these are going to be under autopilot control because you all know how to hand fly, hopefully. We'll go miss on that. And then the last one's going to be an LPV approach with step down. So you can see how we do the LPV approaches with step downs. So those are the 3 flight scenarios that come at the end of this. Some comments, disclaimers. This is what we're talking about tonight. It's very applicable to both the Mooneys and the Warriors. We have the G5 information. The G5s you'll see in the entire fleet. Every plane in our fleet has G5s in it. The GFC 500s we have in both the Mooneys and the Warriors. So what you're going to see is applicable to more than just the Mooneys. Again, as I mentioned, the videos were captured with the simulator, the new simulator that the board funded and Heinz spearheaded designing and putting it together for us. As I said, not everything works exactly the way the real stuff works, but it's close, and you can really get a really good feel for how it's going to operate when you fly the aircraft. Again, you may know some of what you see. Hope you do. So hopefully this will be a refresher for you. I'll try not to put you to sleep while we're going through it. A few references. We've got the manuals online, thanks to Dwight. You just need a Slack account to authenticate, a Wings of Carolina Slack account to authenticate to get to the manuals. Here's a link for a Garmin GTN workshop. This is specific for the GTN series GPSs. If you're interested in that, you can check out Pilot Workshop. Here are 3 on YouTube that are associated with the G3X Touch and the GFC 500. Specifically, the second one there that's listed says Garmin GFC 500 Autopilot Garmin Training. That's not so specific to the G3X Touch. It's really GFC 500, and they actually do that, demonstrating it with G5s. Some other reference material is the for a PC, you can go to Garmin.com and get their Garmin Aviation Trainer. That'll cover the 650s that we have in the fleet, the 650 XIs, and also the GTN 750s. It also covers a GTN 750 XI, but we don't have any of those in the fleet. For the iPad, go to the Apple Store. Just want to point out there are separate trainers for the GTN series versus the GTN XI trainer. So if you want to get the trainer for the 750, make sure you get the one that's the GTN trainer, not the GTN XI trainer. So we're going to go a little bit into the Garmin 500 system components. This is a review of what we did last time, but for those of you that are new, just want you to know what's involved with the system. And the Moonies, at this core of it is the G3X Touch is our primary display for it. It does have some LRUs feeding into that, the ADARs, a temperature probe, and a magnetometer to help give its information. There's also a G5 that's the backup for it, a G5 PFD that shares information with the magnetometer and also the other. So all this information get fed to both those instruments. Then we have the Garmin 750 as the GPS. Then there's the GMC 507 autopilot controller head. Then there's a GAD 29B that helps all these things communicate together. An important thing you need to be aware of if you're going to fly with the autopilot is there's a yoke switch. It's on the left side of the pilot yoke. It has a trim, up and down trim. It also has an autopilot disconnect, trim, interrupt. So the red button, very important to know, it disconnects the autopilot. But if you press and hold it, it also interrupts the power to the servos. So if you get a trim runaway, that's how you stop it from running away until you can find the breakers and turn the breakers off. We also have a go around button or takeoff go around button that's labeled in the plane go around that feeds into the 507. There are also 3 servos. There's one for roll that'll roll the plane left and right. There's a servo that will pitch the plane up and down, just as if you were doing it with the controls. And then we also have a pitch trim servo that runs the trim wheel, just like you do if you're doing it manually. So that's what the system components are made of. We do not have a yaw dampener in the Mooney. The Mooney is certified to have one. We did not choose to pay to get one in there. So the yaw dampener button that's on the GMC 507, it does not do anything for us. So these are the parts of the plane that you'll work with. The rest of it's behind the scenes, but it's just important for you to know that they're back there. If you want to be good with this, you've got to be proficient with the GTN. And this is exactly what I talked about last time. So you got to be good with that. So here's what our Mooney configuration looks like. A couple of things that if you didn't see it last time that are a little different, we now have this fuel gauge. We have a new transponder. There is a change in the CGR was there before, but now it's hooked into the 750 it's more integrated to the 750. So you put the fuel in the 750. You do not set the fuel in the you set the fuel in the CGR. You no longer put the fuel amount in the 750. You also do not put a fuel rate in the 750. It reads how much you're actually consuming from the CGR. We also changed out NAVCOM 2 to a GNC 255. So this is what the stack looks like. This part, the GTX 345 is off to the right over here next to the NAVCOM. This fuel gauge is actually up to the left side over on the left top of the panel. As a result of this, there is an ICAO change. So here's the new ICAO codes. This is the old codes for the Mooneys, at least for 6.8 X-ray. These are the new codes. These new codes will also be the same codes for the 6.0 Romeo when it comes back. So this is where you would change it in the ICAO form on the box 10 and box 18. In 4 flights, where those changes occur are in the ICAO surveillance. So you want to select B2 and E and unselect U2. And under the other information, change the surveillance from 282 Bravo to 260 Bravo. Okay, so that's where we're going to skip forward to the GFC 500 information. So a little bit on the G5. This is the panel for the G5. Again, if you look at the G3X Touch, this looks like a mini version of it. And you can very well think of that way. Pretty much all the most of the information on the top half of the G3X Touch is displayed on the G5. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Just realize that there's a turn coordinator here, or there's a slip skid indicator here. There's a rate of turn indicator here, and this is a lateral CDI. The rest of it, you're probably aware of what it looks like. Speed tape, altitude. There's a vertical speed bar over on the side that's very hard to see. You got the autopilot status bar at the top. There's a ground speed, a baro setting here. And as I indicated last time, if you're going to change the baro setting in the Mooneys now, we recommend you use this knob on the G5. Don't use a knob on the G3X Touch. There's nothing wrong with using one on G3X Touch, except those can change their functionality. You just might as well get used to using this one. This one's dedicated to baro, so you don't have to worry if the functionality has changed or not. All right, so I've got a video. It goes a little bit to show you what it looks like on the Mooney, so I'll bring that up. So this is actually N106 X-ray. This is how you adjust the brightness. So you press this button right here, and that brings the brightness up. Then you can adjust it with the knob on the right. When you get it where you want it, you just press the knob on the right. If you want to go back to auto, you press this twice. Now you see it's back to automatic on the photo cell. If you click it, here's the status bar. This is what it looks like. It's a little different than what's in the Warriors, but you do see the source for the G3X Touch, and this changes from GPS to VOR. Now you can see I got a course line showing up. Let me pause this for a second. Let me back up just a hair. I want to point out something here. So you see right now it shows a GPS source. Now on the 750, I'm going to press the CDI select, and you'll see that when I bring it up again, it's going to bring it up as a VOR because I've changed with using the CDI on the 750. And now I have a course line, so I can dial in my course line on the G5. You can also dial in the course line on the G3X Touch. Just want you to be aware it's available over there. That this pop-up menu does change depending on what's going on with the rest of the system. So now on the G3X, on the 750, I've switched back to the GPS source. And now I'm getting ready to change to the external source. That's why it's wiggling around, because I reached over to the G3X and I've switched it to VOR2 or to NAV2. And you see this is now gone away. So it says, I don't know what you've connected to, but it's not to one of the things I recognize. So I'm going to bring that back up. I'm going to switch the G3X Touch back to NavCom 1, which is the GPS, and now I'm switching the CDI on the 750. So that's just a real quick and dirty on this on the G5, and that is actually, you can see it's in 106 X-ray. Okay. All right, so the G5 is a PFD only. It cannot be switched to an HSI. If you've flown the Warriors, you know the HSI. The bottom G5, which is normally HSI, you can switch it back and forth. You can switch either one of them to HSI. And here, since this is the backup PFD, it can only be a PFD. You cannot switch its functionality. You also cannot use it to disable ESP mode. That's the electronic stability protection mode. The one exception to that is if the G3X has failed, if the G3X Touch fails, there'll be another menu item that you'll see if you do the pop-up menu on the G5. You can now scroll over and turn off the ESP mode. If you're already in emergency and the G3X Touch has failed, I don't know why you'd ever turn off the ESP mode, but it's there if you need to. That G5 can drive the GFC 500. If the G3X Touch fails, you lose no capability on the autopilot. If the G3X Touch fails, you can do it all with the G5. You get full indications on the G5. The G5 has a battery backup. Its battery life is up to 4 hours. Your mileage may vary. You can check the battery status. I didn't point it out, but when I brought up the brightness menu, it also shows you the battery life, what the battery status is, if it's 100% charged or not. The battery status also, if you're running on its internal battery, it also displays at that point. You can press and hold the knob select, and it will sync the altitude bug. Don't recommend you do that. Better, safer, faster way to do it is to use the altitude select knob on the 507. So failure modes, how are they indicated on the G5? It's like on the G3X Touch or most avionics that are display driven like this. They just put big X's across whatever's failed. So that's what they would look like if different things have failed on the G5. A little bit now on some of the GTN basics. Map page, the CDI on the map. Let me get to my laser pointer again. The CDI on the bottom of the map page on the 750 is always GPS driven or derived. It is never localizer or VOR driven, so don't get confused with that. This one at the bottom of that map page is always GPS derived. The CDI button here is used to switch from GPS to VLOC. That is the only way to switch the source. You cannot switch it on the G3X Touch or the G5. You have to do it on the 750. A quick way to get to your flight plan, if you're on the map page, you can just touch this bar where it says, they call it a mini flight plan bar, this KTA Liberty Barrett's Mountain. If you touch on that bar, it will bring the flight plan up. The OBS button here, you can make any waypoint act like a virtual VOR, and it also suspends your waypoint sequencing. When you click OBS again, it will resume your waypoint sequencing. Some of the items you want to check before you fly, especially if you're flying IFR, is where's that takeoff go around button? It's not part of the GTN, but you should know where it is. It is part of the GFC 500. And in our planes, I think they're all labeled go around. They certainly are in the Moonies, and in the Moonies are right above the throttle. And be very careful. You can accidentally bump that when you're adjusting the throttle, or if you're resting your hand on the throttle and hit a little turbulence. And if you do that, it's going to go to go around mode, which is going to command a pitch up wings level. So just be aware that's what's going on. You can always switch back out of that mode. Just reach up and select your lateral and vertical mode again. Just be aware it's very sensitive. If you happen to bump that, you may accidentally turn that on. Is WAS turned off on your 750? And that's how you get to it, system GPS status. And I'll show you a video how you get to that in a minute. Is the ILS CDI captured auto? I'll show you that in a moment as well. That's the sequences you get to it. Some additional items. Is your iPad connected? Most of us are flying with iPads these days. I'll show you where you get connected to that. A system connect setup. And if you get in the plane, you may have to repair. Depends on how many people have flown in the plane and connected up since the last time you were in it. It only remembers about 15 or so, and you essentially get pushed off the stack. You have to forget it on your iPad and repair it. Is the map page set up the way you want? And are the four corner fields configured the way you like them, and use the menu to access that. The details, the orientation of the map, are they what you want? You access those through the menus, and I'll show you all these in the video in just a moment. You like north up, track up, how much stuff you want to display on the map. And some of it will depend on what's actually in the aircraft has. So Heinz has come up with a pretty good checklist. So here it talks about all this. So this is a checklist we can make available. Actually, I'm not sure it's on the website yet, but we can certainly make it available to you that walks you through that on the 750. I went through that kind of crudely, but this is what we were walking through. And now I'm going to show you a video that kind of walks through that as well. So see if I can get this up for you. All right, so the first thing you want to check here is the database validity on that page. We'll click continue. Now you want to go through this instrument self panel test on the top left up there. Make sure all your instruments are communicating correctly. Let me see if I can slow this down a little bit here. Back it up. All right, so there are the databases. Move forward a little bit. All right, so you want to make sure you check these. Don't just come on, pause. Make sure that your instruments are operating correctly. You should see this half left, half up, to, from, on, OBS for 150, desired track 150. You should see that on both the G3X Touch and on the G5. Please check them both to make sure it's talking to both those instruments. Don't just blow by this and forget. And you'll see here on this one on the simulator, the fuel, you cannot click and change it here. And that's exactly what it's going to look like in both of our Moonies now, because it's going to read that fuel quantity from the CGR. All right, so now we're going to go through some of the setups.
TOS system test okay.
Yeah, you'll actually hear that in the plane as well. So it's showing right now this corner down here where the arrow is, this connect setup. It's grayed out, but that's where you go to pair your iPad. Right here. Then we're going to go to GPS status. We're going to go to SBAS, and we're going to check to make sure WAS is turned on. And that's what it looks like if you turn it on and off. Next, we're going to go check the setup, and we're looking for that ILS capture, and it should be auto switch. That's where that is. And last, for those of you that like more fancy stuff, you can go to Utilities, VNav, and select Menu, and you can select the default, what you want for your default flight path angle if you're going to use the VNav capabilities. Sort of an advanced function, but that's where it is. It's not obvious that's where it is, but that's where it's located. And this is also, you need to make sure VNav is enabled. It should be enabled if you want that functionality. Okay, so we're going to go to the map page, talk about the things you want to set up there. So if you go to Menu, Map Setup, this is where you're going to set your orientation for map up, the auto zoom. Change the user fields. That's how you change the four corners. Then you can click on the corner. A lot of things you can change that to. Just to scroll down, you can see the list there, a whole lot of things. So you can set any one of the four corners. If all of them are messed up, you can also just click Restore Defaults, and that's what you get for the default set of fields. All right, so I'm going to quickly, I just loaded in a flight plan. Just wanted to show a couple of things about that. So you might not have noticed, I clicked on the CDI select and it changed from GPS to VLOC down here in the bottom. Okay. So I turned it back to GPS. Now I'm going to click on OBS, and you'll see now, here's my waypoint, and it shows that the OBS is set for 295. I'm now going to go to another part of the screen that I'm not displaying here. I'm going to change the OBS, and you'll see this OBS line change, just demonstrating how you can use the OBS on the 750. So I'm going to go over and scroll it back and forth. And if you watch the number right here, you'll see it changing as I'm changing the OBS on another instrument in this simulator. And I mentioned the quick way to get to the flight plan is click right here. So I'm going to click on that, bring the flight plan up. Then I can do whatever I want to with the flight plan. And then I can click back and go right back to the map. Sort of a quick way to get to the flight plan and back out. See, a lot of people always say click home, they click map, click home, click flight plan. You can toggle back and forth right between them when using that. Okay. All right. All right, so here's the GMC 507 controller, really a core of the autopilot. So the center part of the autopilot is shown here. That's called the engagement selections that you have, or the autopilot status. The AP button engages or disengages the autopilot when you engage it. If you haven't selected something, you can pre-select some things, but if you haven't, it's going to engage by default in roll and pitch mode. The flight director button turns the flight director on and off. If the autopilot's engaged, you cannot turn the flight director off, but if the autopilot's off, or if the autopilot's not engaged, if you hit flight director, that will bring up the flight director bars. And I'll show what that looks like in a minute. If you hit the blue button, the wings level button, or if it engages that on its own, and we'll talk about that when we talk about ESP mode, it's going to command the wings level in a roll and a vertical speed of 0. The yaw dampener I mentioned doesn't do anything in our aircraft. We don't have the yaw dampener servo. All right, so here's what it looks like if you have the flight director on the left, the flight director's on, but the autopilot is not engaged. So you've got hollow magenta bars out here, and here it's in takeoff mode, which shows a 7-degree pitch up. Should be wings level. We're rolled a little bit off because the autopilot's not controlling, so you can do whatever you want. This is just telling you what it's recommending. The flight director. On the right, the flight director's on, the autopilot's on. So we now have the solid magenta bars. And in this case, the autopilot is engaged. We're in heading mode and we're in indicated airspeed climb. So that's the difference in what it looks like if the autopilot's on or the autopilot's off with the flight director's on. All right, the left side of the 507 controller head is your lateral mode selections. So the top left one up here is your heading track. And it's a rotating knob, but you also can push to sync it. So if you push that, it's going to sync your current heading or your current track. The heading button, if you select that, it's going to fly the current heading that you've bugged. Track, it's going to fly the current track that you selected. Rarely, if ever, you're going to use that. I've never had to use it. ATCs, and I've never heard ATC give somebody a track to fly. They will give you a heading. Not sure when you'd want to use it. Nav is going to fly a course or fly an approach. And so it's going to fly a course that you've loaded in, and that can be a course that's based on the VOR. It can be a course based on GPS. And it's also how you fly an approach without vertical guidance. For those of you that fly some autopilots, you always fly approaches in approach mode, whether it has vertical guidance or not. That's not true for this one. If you're flying an approach with no vertical guidance, you strictly use nav mode. The approach mode is to fly an approach with vertical guidance. And now vertical guidance is different than what you might think. It's not necessarily an LPV or an ILS. It could be an an LNAV plus V, or it could be an LP plus V. This autopilot treats those as an approach with vertical guidance. So if you get a plus V indication, you can use the approach mode and it will fly that advisory vertical glide path for you. All right, the right-hand side of the GMC 507 is the vertical mode selections. So you've got an altitude select button here or a knob. You can twist, you can rotate that to bug in your altitude. You can also push it to sync it to your current altitude. The altitude button on the bottom, if you press that, that's going to the autopilot's going to capture your current altitude. Whatever it happens to be, it has nothing to do with what you selected. It's going to capture your current altitude. If you press IAS, it's going to capture your current indicated airspeed and try to maintain that. If you press VS, it's going to capture your current vertical speed and try to maintain that. VNAV gives you the capability to do program descents via altitudes that you've loaded into the GPS. I'm really not going to get into VNAV tonight. And then you've got the nose trim. This is what the nose, this is up and down trim on what the nose of the aircraft is going to do. And you use that to adjust the indicated airspeed that you captured. If you pressed IAS, you use it to adjust your vertical speed. If you've captured it from VS and it's not what you want, it's also how you change your pitch. So if you're in pitch mode, you want to pitch up or down, you just use the thumb to pitch it up or down. It also can change your altitude. If you've captured, let's say you wanted to capture 4,500 feet and you ended up at 4,600, you can use this thumb wheel to thumb it down to 4,500. There is a limitation. You can only do that for up to 200 feet up or down. You can't go more than 200 feet. If you're going to do more than 200, they say do an altitude selection of where you want to go and then select a vertical mode on how you want to get there. Do you want to go down or up at indicated airspeed or vertical speed? All right, so some pre-flights on the GFC 500. Don't overpower the servos. That's different for what we're used to, particularly in the Mooneys. Do not overpower them. In fact, Garmin says all you need to do is let it boot up. If it boots up successfully, that is the pre-flight. I did question one of our installers about that. He says, well, it tests the servos. Like, does it test if the servos are actually connected to anything in the plane? He said, well, no, it doesn't. So I like to make sure it's going to do the controls the way I expect it to. So Heinz has documented here a good pre-flight for us. So you're going to press the autopilot button. It's going to, and these are the displays on the G3X Touch. So the autopilot's engaged, it engages in roll and pitch mode. We're going to center the heading bug. Then we're going to engage heading mode. So we got autopilot, we're engaged in heading. And we're going to turn the heading bug left and right. And we're watching to see, does the yoke look like it's trying to turn us left and turn us right? So now we know the bridle is connected to the roll on the servo. We're going to turn the autopilot off. We're going to test 3 ways to disconnect the autopilot as part of what we're doing this. One, we're going to press the autopilot button on the GMC 507 head. That's one way you can disconnect the autopilot. We're going to re-engage the autopilot. We've gone back to roll mode. We're going to hit the VS mode for vertical. So now you see we got VS and it captured 0 because we're doing the test on the ground. We're not climbing or descending. We're going to use that nose up down trim wheel to indicate we want to climb or a descent. We're going to do both. We want to see it start to pitch up or down. So you're going to see the controls move in or out, your yoke move in or out. That's what you're looking for to make sure it is controlling the elevators. Now we're going to test another disconnect. So we're going to hit the autopilot disconnect switch on the left yoke handle. So that's the second way we disconnect that autopilot. So we've now tested the AP button and we've taken the autopilot disconnect button. We're going to re-engage the autopilot. And now we're going to press the trim switches on the left yoke, make sure that disengages the autopilot. So those are your 3 ways to disconnect it. Autopilot button on the GMC 507, the autopilot disconnect, the red button on the yoke. And if you press the trim switches on the yoke, all 3 of those should disconnect the autopilot. We're going to press the go around button. You should see takeoff, and it should pitch up to a VY. It should show, the flight director should show a pitch up to a VY climb pitch attitude. I showed you this a minute ago. That's what it looks like again. So it should pitch up to it should show the flight director to a pitch up of about 7 degrees. And they should be hollow. And we see you got takeoff and takeoff. So you can select takeoff mode. You can hit the flight director button to turn it off if you want. Once you've done that, make sure your flight controls are free, that the autopilot's completely disconnected from the servos. You can move the yoke freely. Lastly, make sure you know where the autopilot and the pitch trim circuit breakers are. What you want to do if you have an anomaly, you want to press and hold the red autopilot, disconnect, trim, interrupt, find those breakers and pull them, and do that before you release that red button. Make sure your elevator trim is set for takeoff. Even if you set it before, recheck it now, because as you're playing around with this, the autopilot may have run that pitch trim servo. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, speak up or shoot something in chat, and Hans will let me know. Some of the limitations on the GFC 500. For certification, the requirements are that the pilot must be in the left seat with a seatbelt fastened. You cannot use the GFC 500 for takeoff or landing. Pre-flight must be completed successfully. That's not the pre-flight we just talked about, that it boots up and does not give you an error. That's all they're claiming. They're not saying that your pre-flight has to do what I just described went correctly. It means it must boot up and not give you an error. And that applies to the autopilot or the flight director. You cannot use either of them unless it boots up correctly. The maximum fuel imbalance you're allowed to use the GFC 500 is 15 gallons. So you want to keep it balanced on the 2 sides. For the Warriors, I believe it was 10 gallons. So it's a little bit more on the Moonies, but it's still, you need to keep your fuel within 15 gallons of imbalance. You're only allowed to use this above 800 AGL, with the one exception if you're flying an approach. If you're flying an approach, you can fly it down to 200 before you're required to disconnect it. Let me say, the autopilot does not disconnect on its own. You must do it. It will not disconnect. You have to tell it to disconnect, and you should do it anytime you're below 800 AGL. When again, the one exception is if you're on the approach, you can fly it down to 200 AGL.
So it will just keep right on going. You won't disconnect it at 200 feet.
Yeah. So George just asked, so it will just keep on going below the 200 feet. Yes, if you're flying an approach and you don't press disconnect, it's going to slam you into the runway. It's going to fly you right down to the runway. Yeah.
Steve asked, where does the autopilot boot fail enunciation appear?
All right. So the question is, where does the autopilot boot fail enunciation appear? It's going to appear in the status bar on the G3X Touch and in the status bar on the G5. You'll get an AP with a red X in the middle of it. Okay, so just look at that autopilot status bar. It's also give you an audible tone that it failed. It'll let you know, but just look at that status bar on the G3X Touch or on the G5 for the autopilot.
Quick question.
Sure.
Is there a forced disconnect? And George's question made me think about something. If somebody forgot to disconnect it, for whatever reason, can you override the autopilot in terms of, it's commanding, say, 400, 500 feet per minute, ready to descent, and you don't like that, you didn't, for some reason, disconnect it, can you overpower?
So the question is, can you overpower it if you forget to disconnect it? Yes, you can overpower it. Recognize if you overpower it, if you relax that pressure, because when you start to overpower it, it's going to start to trim to compensate for what you're trying to do versus what it wants to do. So you actually can make the situation worse, because now if you relax the pressure, so let's say you're trying to make it pitch up and it wants to pitch down and you're forcing it up, it's going to start trimming more and more to try to force it down. You can overpower it, absolutely can. And they specifically say, do not try to overpower it in flight, because if you happen to let go, it's now really trimmed aggressively to compensate for what you're doing. So like I say, know where those disconnects are, know where that red button is. That's why it's red. That's why it's on the yoke right there at your left hand. Press and hold it. If it's misbehaving, press that button, hold it until you find those breakers and disconnect those breakers before you let go.
Otherwise, when you shut it off, it will give you an airplane headed for somewhere you don't want to go.
Correct. It will. So what George is saying, if you don't shut it off, it'll put you somewhere you don't want to go. That's true. That's also that, and that's why they say don't try to overpower it unless you're going to shut it off. Because if you don't shut it off when you let go, it's really going to command something you really don't want. And the real important part there is press the red button. You press it once, it's going to disconnect it's supposed to disengage the autopilot. If you press and hold it, then it's an interrupt and will stop the power to all the servos while you find the breakers to pull the breakers in case there's a pitch trim runaway or one of the servos is just going totally crazy. You now have time to find the breakers. You can shut the power off to everything.
But shit me on this, if I'm pulling back on the stick, it's trimming against me. If I then turn off the autopilot, it gives me the airplane back, the trimmed nose down.
Yes. All right. So what George is getting at it, if you've been if it's running away and you're trying to overpower it and it's running away, when you disconnect the servo, it doesn't correct the trim issue. So when it disconnects, you're going to have to manually adjust the pitch trim. So you may have to be pretty aggressive on finding your pitch trim wheel and trim it yourself. That's not going to be true in the roll or the normal pitch, but it would be true for the pitch trim. So the pitch trim's going to run, and it's going to have the pitch trimmed way out of whack, and you're going to have to manually adjust that back. The roll servos they'll just disengage. They don't disengage, they just power down, and you now will have full control just like you do normally flying the aircraft. A little different for the pitch trim because it's rolling the pitch trim wheel. To answer that question sufficiently, George?
Yeah, it's been true of the autopilots we've had.
Yes. Yeah.
Most autopilots.
Right. Yeah.
It's scary.
Okay, so the last thing I don't know if it's the last thing or not. No, it's not. Okay, so the engagement, there are some limits on what speed you're allowed to engage this autopilot for the Mooneys. It's 80 to 185 knots. I think it's 65 to 140 or maybe 160 for the Warriors, but for the Mooneys, it's 80 to 185 knots when you're allowed to engage it. It is approved for Cat 1 precision approaches and for non-precision approaches. Some of the command limits for the autopilot, it will command a pitch up to plus 20 degrees or a pitch down to minus 15 degrees. That's its command limits. In other words, that's what it may want the aircraft to do. It will do a roll up to 30 degrees, which is more than a standard rate, but it can command a roll of up to plus or minus 30 degrees in the roll. It has a set of engagement limits. The engagement limits where you can turn the autopilot on and it will engage is plus or minus 50 degrees in pitch. If you're outside of that, it will not engage. And up to plus or minus 75 degrees in roll. It will engage. And if you force it beyond those limits, that autopilot is going to disengage. It will not engage if you're past those limits. And if you forced it past those limits, it will disengage. If you engage the autopilot outside of the command limits, so outside of the command limits, but within the engagement limits, the autopilot will engage and try to take you back to these command limits. So it will automatically try to go back to to be with a pitch within that range and roll within this range.
At what G rate will they try to correct?
They don't specify the G rate.
You couldn't instruct the airplane.
I do not believe it will. I will say the roll rate that I've experienced in the Moonies is fairly mild on the roll rate. The pitch rate seems to be a little more aggressive, which is opposite of what we experienced in the Warriors. They pitch rather slowly and roll rather aggressively, but even there, it's nothing like you're used to as far as snap rolls or really yanking back really hard. It's moderately aggressive for what we're used to in GA, but it's not going to overstress the airframe. All right, so I want to show you a little bit about the ESP mode. This is a little video on that from Garmin training.
All right. So let's go into a little bit of our electronic stability and protection, all right, or what we call ESP. Now, we're not reading your mind, but we're trying to keep you in a safe and protected envelope. It's going to correct for bank, for pitch, and airspeed exceedances, and it's going to try to keep us back in that safe envelope. We'll talk about a little bit more here, the bank protection, pitch protection, as well as some airspeed. This is a feature that is automatically armed above 500 AGL. We don't want the ESP trying to kick in when you're below or real low to the ground. And as we come in on a descent, it's going to automatically disarm below 200 feet AGL. Last thing we want is we're going in, or we're getting into the flare. And last thing we want is the servos trying to drive the nose down. That would be a little counterproductive for us there. So it does auto arm and it does the auto disarm. We'll talk about here in just a little bit how we can turn it on, turn it off, or override it, but we'll talk about that here in a bit. For our bank protection, typically the autopilot is trying to discourage us beyond banking beyond 45 degrees of bank. On the picture to the left, notice how on the G5 I've got a double green hash mark. So when the autopilot is off, I'm hand flying the aircraft, I'm going to see that double mark. As soon as I turn the autopilot on, those marks are going to go ahead and disappear from the screen. So what will happen is I start rolling the aircraft. I roll past 45 degrees of bank. So in the case here, you'll notice the yellow line, or there, those green hash marks are going to move up. They're going to move to 30 degrees, and they're going to go to yellow. So now the servos are going to engage, and they're going to try to get us back in within 30 degrees. So we've gone to 45. We've rolled past it manually. The system's trying to roll us back within less than 30. The further you go past that 45-degree mark, the more aggressive the servos are going to engage. This does have a limit though. If you go past 75 degrees of bank, the autopilot, the servos are going to disengage. You're kind of on your own. So it's not going to handle if you go inverted or anything massively aggressive like that, but it is going to keep us in try to do its best to keep us in that safe and protected envelope. Pitch engagement is the same sort of thing. We're trying to discourage between pitching up or pitching down too far. Now, unlike the roll is pretty standard at 45 degrees of bank. The pitch is going to vary from airframe to airframe. So, an important one here, anybody that is going to be flying the GFC 500, some of the required reading is going to be taking a look at the Aircraft Flight Manual Supplement, the AFMS. This is going to tell you what those pitch limits are. So they're going to vary whether it's a Piper Warrior versus a 210 versus a G33. It's all going to vary. So pay attention, take the time, read through the AFMS, and know when those are going to increase, or know what those limits are. Just like the roll protection, the further I pitch up or pitch down away from the set reference, the more the servos are going to fight against me. Whole idea, we're keeping the aircraft in a safe and protected envelope while we're hand flying the aircraft. Now we do go one step further as well. If you're in one of those ESP, whether it's bank or it's pitch for too long, in this case, if you're there for 10 seconds within a 20-second time period, the autopilot is automatically going to engage. You'll get an oral alert that the autopilot is engaging, and it'll automatically put you into level mode. It doesn't know what's happened. It assumes something went wrong, so it's going to command the aircraft back into level flight. This is a feature. Level mode via ESP will automatically arm above 2000 AGL, and it's going to automatically disarm below 1500 AGL through descent. So if you get lower to the ground, then it will disable itself, so it's not trying to fight you. But anything above that, if you're in that protected area for too long or outside of the protected area for too long, it will engage level mode. Now the high speed and low speed protection, these are more features when the autopilot's on. So high speed, we're trying to keep you from going past V&E, and then low speed protection, we're trying to prevent you from, essentially we're trying to keep you from stalling. It's going to keep you from going below a set airspeed. For both of these, we do require a Garmin PFD and or a GTN with a valid terrain database. So for all these modes that for automatically arming and disarming, we've got to have something to reference off of. That's the terrain database. For the high and low speed protection, this is always going to inhibit below 200 feet AGL. So as you get into the landing flare, there's no worries that the autopilot's going to try to drive the nose down. It is automatically going to disable. For the overspeed, as we said, this is going to work when the autopilot's on in certain modes, climbing and descending. If we go too fast, it is going to automatically start pitching the nose up. It doesn't want to exceed the maximum airspeed or the maximum airframe airspeed. You'll get a max speed alert on your G5s, and your vertical mode, whatever we could be in a vertical speed descent, it will automatically change into IAS, indicated airspeed, meaning it's going to now raise the nose up, usually a knot or two above, or excuse me, below V&E, and it's going to maintain that airspeed until we've done something. We've reduced power or the aircraft slowed down enough. The previous mode is still armed, so once we get the aircraft slowed down, the previous mode can take back over and continue with that descent again. Same thing's going to happen for underspeed protection, or USP. Same thing. The autopilot's on. We're going to discourage operation below an established airspeed. Once again, this is going to vary from airframe to airframe. Take a look at the aircraft flight manual supplement for those airspeeds there. But we're going to get the same alert. I'm going to min speed alert this time, and if we're going too slow, and it's going to do the opposite of the overspeed. If we start getting too slow, it's going to start pitching the nose down. It wants to keep airflow going over the wings. Same as overspeed protection, we're going to go into an IAS mode, so it's going to set a speed that's a couple knots faster than that specified stall speed. We're going to get an airspeed alert again if the altitude starts becoming critical. Same thing as the overspeed protection. Once we get the airspeed back into a proper mode, IAS, indicated airspeed, can drop off, and our previous mode can pick back up. So big high level stuff. For pitch and roll protection, the autopilot is not engaged, and we're keeping the aircraft in that, and we'll engage if the aircraft's in the proper engagement envelope. So if you're doing any sort of crazy maneuvering, we may be outside of the normal autopilot engagement zone, so it may not be able to take in. To pay attention to the AFMS on that one. For underspeed and overspeed protection, this is for the autopilot is engaged. We're at least at a GPS altitude greater than 200 feet. And once again, we're in the autopilot engagement envelope. Now, I know there's going to be some out there. Okay, this is a training aircraft, or I'm getting ready, I want to do some maneuvers, or I don't want to worry about ESP turning on. We do have ways around it. For instance, here, if I'm doing a commercial standard steep turn, we know that goes to 50 degrees of bank. Obviously, if I go past 45, ESP is going to kick in. I need some way to override it. So in the case of the 500 here, if I press and hold the autopilot disconnect, I can press and hold on the yoke, I can roll past 45 degrees of bank, and ESP, the servos, are not going to engage. The moment I let up, however, if I'm past 45, I will feel the servos engage and start trying to drive me back within 30 degrees. But this is a temporary measure. I still want ESP, but I'm purposely doing something that I know I'm going to go past standard ESP envelope, so press and hold the button. I can also turn it off a little bit more permanently. If I press the knob on the G5, I can roll that knob over to, I'll have an ESP box. and I can press that knob to disable ESP. So now for the rest of that flight, ESP will not engage for me at all. So there's two ways we can do it, temporary or the more permanent, the ESP disable. For those running G3X, same thing. I hold the AP disconnect, that's still the temporary, but this time on G3X, if I tap the autopilot status box, it'll bring up a whole window for me for the AFCS, and that's where I can control the autopilot directly from the display, as well as the GMC 507, and I'll have an ESP button that I can press to turn ESP on or off, just like we did on the G5.
Okay, we've got a question.
Sean, when you were talking about engagement limits, when you press the blue button, are the engagement limits applicable for that?
The question is, are the engagements applicable if you press the blue button, the level button? Yes. If you're outside those limits, the blue button's not going to help you because it's outside what it knows how to deal with. So it will only engage if you're within those limits. Not the command limits, but the engagement limits. So if you're banked over more than 75 degrees, blue button's not going to help you. You're on your own. That's kind of what he was saying. You're on your own. One thing you mentioned here about disabling the ESP, that it's when you turn it off, that it's disabled for the rest of the flight. It's only disabled for the rest of the flight if you don't go back in and turn it back on. You can turn it off temporarily, do some maneuvers, and go back in and turn it back on during that same flight. What he's getting at, it's off until you do that or until the system reboots. When the system reboots, it comes back up. It always comes back with ESP enabled. So it's not one that it remembers off, turn it off, so it stays off until somebody turns it back on. That one is by default on anytime the system boots up.
So if in the Mooneys we have the G5 and the G3X touch, was it saying you cannot disable ESP from the G5 in the Mooney installation?
The question is, can you disable the ESP mode? Because we have the G3X touch. Can you not disable it from the G5? No, you cannot unless the G3X touch has failed. If the G3X is up and running, that's where you have to disable the ESP mode. You cannot disable it from the G5. If the G3X touch has failed, you'll get it in the menu, on the pop-up menu on the G5, there now is going to be an ESP disconnect mode, just like we have in the Warriors normally. Okay. Yes, another question from the crowd.
Mark says, so in a frozen pitot scenario, you have to disable the autopilot using red yoke button or disable ESP, correct?
Frozen pitot. My gut reaction is yes, but my gut reaction is turn off the autopilot. And you probably would have to disable ESP so it wouldn't try to take over. So I would say press the autopilot disconnect, pull the breakers.
Is that supposing that that's going to give an erroneous airspeed reading and cause the ESP to kick in?
I think that's what he means by frozen pitot.
Well, it's going to mess up your airspeed. So that should only affect you if the autopilot's engaged. The other ESP modes are if you're rolled too steeply or pitched too steeply. And it gets that information from the AHRS associated with the G3X or the G5. The airspeed limitations for underspeed and overspeed, where it's going to try to pitch to hold an airspeed, is only applicable if your autopilot's controlling. So you should be able to just disconnect the autopilot. But again, if you don't know what's going on, press and hold, pull the breakers, hand flight.
Yes.
So you're saying that if you're flying along, you didn't turn on pitot heat, all of a sudden airspeed indicator goes boom towards zero. Then the system is going to pitch you down if the autopilot's on.
Correct. So the question is, if you're flying along, you're on the autopilot, you've got to turn the pitot heat on and it froze up and the airspeed goes to zero, the autopilot's going to start to push the nose down. Yes. Because you're going to get a minimal speed, you're going to get an audible warning, And then it's going to start to try to maintain that minimum airspeed. So it's going to start to pitch down. It's going to be in IAS mode, going to start to pitch down. The way you stop that, disengage the autopilot.
If the pitot freezes over, it's just gonna lock on that airspeed. The airspeed won't go to zero because it functions on pressure, not airflow.
Right.
So it seals the pressure in the pitot, and the airspeed at a constant altitude won't change. But we could sit here and craft a situation where the airspeed.
Well,
would-
okay.
would-
If you came up with a situation where the airspeed did go to zero, it will pitch down. We can argue why it did that, but it would try to pitch down. But the point is, the overspeed and underspeed are only applicable if the autopilot is engaged. The other modes for the roll and bank, it doesn't matter if the autopilot's engaged or not. It will, if you go past those, it will engage. It will engage in level mode. Initially, it will try to push you back in the right area, kind of like the lane assist in a car. It'll try to roll you back level or try to pitch you up or down to get you back within what it wants you to be in. But if you fight it too long, it will command wings level and it will take over. And it's pretty aggressive on doing that. Could you overpower it? I think you could, but you're going to have to apply a lot more force than you would normally.
So the roll and pitch is a function of the PFD, and the airspeed is a function of the autopilot. In terms of the ESP.
That's more in the system architecture side. The autopilot is getting the roll and pitch information from the PFD.
Would this be adequate to say then that autopilot will say not engaged and someone is disoriented in the weather and put themselves into an unusual attitude, that this is a automatic corrective mode if you don't fight it? Would that be adequate to say that the airplane will in fact recover itself if you have put it into an unusual attitude and let go?
It will. It should, unless you do something to fight it and it rolls past the 75. Again, if you do it fast enough, you may get past the 75. Because again, remember when it engages if you're outside its limits, you're outside the command limits for more than 10 seconds in a 20-second window, it will engage. Now, within that 10 seconds, if you went past 75, it's not then going to engage. If you get past its command, not its command limits, its engagement limits. So you could get past that in time. But if it's sort of a normal situation, it should. The best thing to do is, as soon as you realize it, hit the blue button, hit the level button. Don't wait for it to have don't wait for it to do it. Be more assertive and say, I don't know what's going on. Oh, it's going to take over in 10 seconds. Well, it might get too out of whack in 10 seconds. Hit the level button.
But this seems, it's a system design, I think, for the pilot that goes, let's say, VFR into IMC. He's not instrument rated. He starts to lose control. He's,
It's designed for any of us that fly in the clouds.
what's that?
It's designed for any of us that fly in the cloud, not just a VFR pilot that ventures into a cloud.
Yeah.
You can get into a cloud and you get some turbulence. You may get in a situation you don't really know what's just happened. Hit the wings level button. All right, we'll move on. This one may be a little beneath a lot of you, hopefully, but my thought here is that there may be people that don't know much about autopilots. So I'm going to put this one in here. It's a fairly short video. It's from Sporties. It's actually part of their instrument training course, but I thought it was a pretty good video on just the basic functionality of an autopilot. And they're specifically talking about the GFC 500 and the G5.
Autopilots for light airplanes are typically classified as single-axis or dual-axis. A single-axis system controls roll only to fly a heading or a GPS course. A dual-axis system controls both roll and pitch, adding the ability to climb or descend and hold a specified altitude. Larger airplanes typically have a three-axis autopilot, which adds a rudder control system known as a yaw damper. This prevents excessive yawing in larger airplanes when flying in rough air and provides a more comfortable ride for the occupants. For the scenarios that follow, we are going to use the Garmin GFC 500 autopilot to demonstrate normal IFR operations. The GFC 500 is an aftermarket system which connects to a Garmin flight display for control information, like the G5 electronic flight instrument. The interface on the GFC 500 autopilot features a series of buttons and knobs and displays mode status and annunciations at the top of the G5 flight display in the autopilot status box. In most installations, the red autopilot disconnect button on the control yoke serves two purposes. First, you can press it one time to disengage the autopilot. It can also be pressed and held down to temporarily interrupt the electric trim should the electric motor start operating on its own and trimming the airplane to an uncommanded flight attitude. When the button is released, the faulty trim system would continue to operate again. This is designed to give you time to follow the checklist and remove power from the electric system, typically by pulling the autopilot circuit breaker. The autopilot status box at the top of the G5 flight instrument includes three separate sections: lateral mode, autopilot status, and vertical mode.
All right, let me just comment on that. Okay, so on the G3X Touch, the autopilot status is all the way to the left, the lateral mode is in the center, and the vertical mode is to the right. It still has three sections. They just, for some reason, for the G3X Touch, they switched them around.
When the flight director and autopilot are disengaged, this status box will be blank. When you engage the autopilot, the letters AP will appear in green in the status section, indicating the autopilot is flying the airplane. Garmin uses green and white coloring for the various mode enunciations to show active versus armed status. The active lateral and vertical mode will always be shown in green in the innermost position. If you were to program the autopilot to capture a GPS or approach course while on a specific heading, those armed modes will always show in the outermost position in white. The first thing to understand with any autopilot is what will happen when it is engaged. After pressing the AP button on the controller, the GFC 500 defaults to roll and pitch modes. You'll see the letters AP in green at the top of the G5, indicating the autopilot is engaged, along with ROL and PIT enunciations to indicate that these modes are active. Roll mode will maintain the current bank angle when flying from 6 to 30 degrees. If you are in a bank of less than 6 degrees, it will roll to wings level. Activation at bank angles greater than 30 degrees will be returned to this upper limit. Pitch mode will maintain the current pitch angle, provided that your current attitude is within a range of 15 degrees nose down to 20 degrees nose up. Activation of the system outside of these limits will return the pitch to the respective limit. For additional control during the climb or descent, you can select a specific rate of climb or descent for the autopilot to fly using the vertical speed function. The vertical speed mode, which is activated with the VS button, will hold the current vertical speed when the mode is selected. The current rate will appear in the vertical speed reference box below the altimeter and in the autopilot status box.
One other difference you'll see is some of the indications like this, the vertical speed, does not show up at the bottom of our altitude tape on the G3X Touch. It does on the G5.
You can adjust the rate of climb or descent in 100-foot increments by using the pitch wheel on the autopilot controller if desired. You can also have the autopilot pitch for a particular speed during the climb using the airspeed hold function. For example, you hold VY for the best rate of climb. To activate this, press the IAS button, short for indicated airspeed, and use the pitch wheel to select the desired airspeed on the G5 flight instrument. You'll see the selected airspeed in the reference box above the airspeed tape.
Okay, on the G3X Touch, you do not get the reference above the indicated airspeed tape either.
And in the autopilot status box. While flying en route, you can use the altitude hold function to maintain a specific altitude. With the autopilot engaged, press the ALT button, and the autopilot will make pitch changes as necessary to maintain the current altitude. The vertical mode enunciation will show ALT and the captured altitude value in green. It's a good practice to also set the current altitude on the G5 in the window above the altimeter for reference. The GFC 500 can also level off at a pre-selected altitude after a climb or descent. First, make sure the desired altitude is entered in the G5 at the top right of the altimeter tape. You'll see the enunciation ALTS in white at the top of the G5, indicating altitude hold mode is armed. As you near the selected altitude during the climb, the autopilot will command a level off and hold that altitude. The vertical mode enunciation will change to ALT in green and show the selected altitude value in the status box, confirming altitude hold is now active. Another function you'll use often when flying IFR is heading mode. To use this, first set the heading bug using either the knob on the G5 directional instrument or the heading knob on the GFC 500 to the desired heading and press the HDG button. The status bar will show the enunciation of HDG in green, indicating that mode is active. The autopilot will then command a bank and turn as necessary as you change the heading bug to a new heading.
Okay, so this is a quiz I gave before in the last session, so I'll do it again here. So here we see the GMC 507 control head with some lights that are lit up and the status bar for the G3X Touch and the G5. So let's talk about what modes we're in. So if we look at, let me get my laser pointer. If we look at the center part, we see that the autopilot's engaged, so we should have the flight director up and the autopilot should be on. So we get the APs here, and on the G5, it's in the center, so the autopilot is engaged. If we look at the lateral mode, we've got heading and approach. And if we look at our status bar, heading is the active mode. And GPS for the approach is the armed mode. So we see that here. We also see it here. It's the same color scheme, except the background's blue on the G3X and black on the G5. So heading is active. The approach GPS is armed. And over here, we're in altitude hold mode. So altitude is captured as that's the active mode. And the glide path is armed. So we're set up for an RNAV approach. So we go through that. So the autopilot's engaged. It's controlling both pitch and roll, active modes, lateral is heading, and vertical mode is hold. And the arm modes are lateral for the GPS for the RNAV approach, verticals for the glide path for the RNAV approach with vertical guidance. Remember I said you use the approach mode if you have vertical guidance. So this one has, we're assuming this one has vertical guidance. We've armed it as if we do have vertical guidance. Okay.
Quick question.
Sure.
If you were going to a fix and ATC just said, just set and maintain 4,000, proceed to, do you set the altitude first and then select the mode you want to descend with?
Yeah, so the question is, if you're flying along and ATC says, in this example, we're at 5 and ATC says descend, maintain 4,000. How do I go about doing that? The procedure is dial the altitude select down to 4,000. That doesn't change the altitude you're currently captured. You've captured 5,000. You can dial the heading, the altitude bug down or altitude select down to anything you want. And then you tell the autopilot, how do I want to get there? Do I want to go down at indicated airspeed or do I want to go down at a vertical speed? So you would press IS or VS. Now realize it's going to capture what I'm currently doing. So if I press VS and I'm level, VS is going to be 0. So then I would use the thumb wheel. Right. So if I press VS, it's going to capture, the VS is going to be 0, hopefully, unless I'm in turbulence. Then I would take this thumb wheel. I want the nose to go down. So I would rule the thumb wheel up to push the nose down, right? I'm trimming the nose down. And I'll look at the digital readout I get in the status bar that tells me how fast I'm dialing that to go down. 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, whatever you like. Same thing if I want to do it by IAS. So maybe I'm doing 145 knots and I tell I want to descend. So I pick IAS. Well, to descend, I'm going to have to go a little faster than that, or else I'm going to have to pull power. So I can either pull the power and it will maintain the current airspeed I have. If I reduce the power, it's just going to pitch down. to hold that indicated airspeed. If I want to scream down, I could tell it, all right, I want to go a little faster. So I'm going to push the nose down. That's going to put the indicated airspeed up. So that's how you would do that. And it would fly down to that altitude you selected and will level off. But remember, you're in control of the throttle. So whenever it gets there, you've got to do something when it levels off. If I've reduced the power to descend down, if I level off, the power's still reduced, you're going to start to get slower and slower. So make sure you do something when you level off.
Does VNAV have a defaulted rate of descent? If you select VNAV to descend?
The question is, does VNAV have a default? There's a lot of criteria around VNAV. There is a default. That was the thing I showed you in the GFC, the GTN 750. There is a default flight path angle. You can override any segment. Once you have an active VNAV section, you can go in and change that, but that will be the default. Like it came up, it was 3 degrees for a flight path angle. That's kind of default. You can change the default. You can also change it once you've engaged one. Okay. All right, some emergency procedures. And again, most of the emergencies come down to something very simple. Know how to turn the power off to the autopilot while maintaining control. Grab the control wheel, because as we were talking about before, it may have trimmed things way out of whack. And when you disengage the autopilot, you've now got full control, and you may have to have a fair amount of control, particularly in the pitch, before you can get that trim back manually. Press and hold the autopilot, disconnect, trim, interrupt. Pull the autopilot and pitch trim circuit breakers. And then you can release the button at that point. And if you're overspeed, you got to reduce power, monitor the attitude. If you're underspeed, you need to add power, monitor your attitude and altitude. So again, you're back to hand flying it. Just be aware when and I mean it seriously when I say grab the controls wheel tightly, because when it lets go, when you hit that autopilot disconnect, trim, interrupt, you may have some pretty severe forces. So make sure you're ready for it. All right. And review the AFMS for the GFC 500 for your airframe. So the normal procedures for loss of navigation information: select the heading mode, select a valid nav source, select a nav mode at that point. For loss of airspeed data, autopilot's going to disconnect, kind of what you were talking about a little ago. If it loses the data, not if it goes to zero, but if it just loses, it says I've lost airspeed data, it's going to disconnect. Press the autopilot disconnect, trim, interrupt to cancel it, because you'll get a tone and it's just going to keep going. If you want to get rid of the tone, you got to press the button, the red knob, to get the tone to go away. Then you got to fly the aircraft yourself and use the manual trim. If you lose altitude data, it's going to revert to pitch for the vertical mode. If you're in altitude hold mode, select a different vertical mode. You could select indicated airspeed, or you could select VS. You just can't use the altitude hold mode because it doesn't have altitude data anymore. For heading data source failure, select a different lateral mode. You could use track or nav if the heading source, in other words, the magnetometer goes bad, you don't have heading any information anymore. One of the few times you might want to use track. You could also use navigate along one of your courses.
The flight manual supplement is on the manuals.
The question is the flight manual supplement on the Wings of Carolina manual page? Yes, they are.
Thank you.
Yep. If you look under the autopilot section, there'll be an AFMS for the GFC 500 associated for the Mooney. There's also one there for the Warrior. If you lose the GPS information on the GTN 750, just a couple of notes. GPS, VOR, localizer, or back course, it's going to go to roll mode. ILS, it's going to go to pitch mode. One of the issues is the GFC 500 uses GPS aiding. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it does use a GPS information for also flying VORs, localizer, and back courses. That's what the manual says. I've not tried it because I haven't tried turning off the GPS. I don't even know how to turn the GPS information off. So what you want to do in that case is select a different lateral mode and a vertical mode. On an approach, disconnect and continue, or go miss, kind of your options there. The important part there, so what I'm pointing out is that it does use GPS for the VOR navigation, localizer, and for back course modes. So just be aware of those. Okay. Anybody have any questions before we do the flights? I got the three flights I'm going to go through. They're going to take probably until about 9 o'clock. We'll try to get, I couldn't shrink it down, but so much. Some of them are, the second one's particularly a little bit longer. So the first one we're going to fly with the VOR vectors and ILS. We're not going to use a GPS for any guidance at all. So this is kind of the track we'd end up flying the ILS. We're going to take off. We're going to fly out. We're going to intercept a VOR radial. Then we're going to turn, fly vectors down, and we're going to come in around and we're going to do vectors to final for the ILS, just using the Nav 1 radio and the GFC 500 to fly it. So we're going to depart runway 3. We're going to enter controlled airspace on a heading of 360. And ATC is getting a little nasty where they said 3,000, expect 4,000 in 10 minutes. And then they gave us intercept the Liberty 100 radio to Liberty. Never gotten that clearance, but we got a nasty controller today. So then we're going to ask for vectors for the ILS Zulu 3 back into Tango Tango Alpha. So let's try flying that. And this is off the simulator we have here. You'll see I'll try to describe it as we're flying it. So this is the panel off our simulator next door. You'll see it's with dual G5. Just think of those as smaller version of a G3 with a 650. Let me get my notes here. So we selected the runway heading. We're dialing in the altitude up to 3,000 feet. So you'll see you dialing in that on the top G5, the PFD. So we'll dial it up to 3,000 feet. And then we're going to clear the message light that's flashing at us on the 650. We're going to check our nav frequency that we've dialed in our Liberty VOR because we know we're going to be navigating off of that. So we've got Liberty dialed in, and amazingly enough, we were picking up Liberty on the ground. Don't usually get that. I think I went to get coffee right here. We're going to engage takeoff mode. We're going to select takeoff mode on the takeoff go around. That does not work on the simulator, but that's essentially what we would normally want to do. So we're going to take off. I left the sound in here so you can see I'm really starting to fly. That down a little bit. So we've taken off. I'm going to engage the autopilot. It's going to engage in roll and pitch. So if you look up at the top G5, you'll see the status bar goes to roll and pitch. The autopilot's engaged. And you'll see the altitude select is armed. Now I've switched to heading mode and indicated airspeed, and I'm dialing the indicated airspeed up to 87 knots. I've dialed it up to 87. I'm in heading mode, indicated airspeed. We're turning to a heading of 360. I'm taking my heading bug to that. I've just scrolled around to that. Since we're in heading mode, it's going to scroll right around to that. I've changed the CDI to V-lock. So you can see I now have green needles here. I'm going to switch over here and I'm going to select the course. 280. 279, I can't read well. And we're going to turn to that course line. All right, so I skipped ahead a little bit. So when we get to 3,000 to 2,000, we should get a flash and a tone. You don't hear the tone on here, but you normally get a tone and a flash that says we're within 1,000 feet of our target altitude. Get within 200 feet, we're going to get another flash, and there's a tone that we're within 200 feet of our target altitude. And it's going to level off at 3,000. flashing, so we've now captured our 3,000 feet. And it's leveling off, speeding up, so I'll reduce the power a little bit so we don't overspeed. So you can see I'm flying towards my course line here. And I've engaged nav mode. It's not showing up here yet. You will see it. Let me just make a comment about that. So I'm in heading mode. So heading is active. I'm arming the nav mode. You just don't see it here yet because this in nav mode, it doesn't do what's called an any angle intercept. It immediately in the simulator, when I hit nav mode, it immediately goes to a 45-degree intercept. The real plane does not do that. So I'm having to kind of fake it out a little bit here, but that's what's going to happen. I will say if you're in a heading mode and you're not headed towards your course line, it will stay in heading mode until you fly around the globe. So you have to set your plane up to fly towards your course line if you're going to engage nav mode, or the nav's never going to become active. So now you see the nav's engaged. This would not do heading and then arm the nav. And it's going to turn to a 45-degree intercept. That's one of the little differences with our simulator versus what the real plane does. Waiting, so I'm checking now to make sure our VOR was active. Let's back that up a little bit. So you'll see, I go over here and I just double check to make sure I've got the right nav aid in and it's ID'd, and it is. Skip ahead a little bit, you'll see the needles are starting to move in. We've now been given we also in the middle of this, we've been given an indicated to climb to 4,000 feet. So I'm going to initiate a climb at an indicated airspeed. I've now dialed in 90 knots for my indicated airspeed. I'm going to climb to 4,000 feet. So I'm still in the nav mode. It's still intersecting my course line, and I'm climbing to 4,000 feet. I'm just going to slow down to about 90 knots to do that climb. And I see my altitude target is, my altitude selected is the arm mode. So it's now captured at 4,000 feet. So we've now asked for vectors, and ATC's now given us a vector to fly heading 210. I've turned my heading bug to 210. Then going to select heading mode, so I confirm I'm in heading mode. Always confirm when you press a button over here. You get the status bar readout on the G5 and the G3X touch. So it's now going to turn to the 210 heading. This over here looking at what lights are lit up on the G507 control head. ATC is doing has told us to descend, maintain 3,000. So I've dialed in 3,000 as my altitude select. I'm still holding 4,000. Haven't initiated the descent yet. So now select PS mode. So it captured 0, and now I'm using the thumb wheel, the nose wheel here. I'll dial it down to go to descend at 500 feet per minute. I'm powering back so I don't get too fast. So I reduce the power for the descent. I'm now going to come over here. I'm going to switch in my ILS frequency. I've got the ILS frequency loaded here. I'm going to toggle that into the active side. down here. I know the inbound course is 030. I'll dial in that inbound course on the ILS. And I'm leveling off at 3,000. I got the 200-foot fall out there, so we're going to start to level off at 3,000 feet. Still don't have any indication we have the ILS, so we don't have our course showing. The HSI. So we're on a downwind now, essentially downwind for runway 3. ATC is going to call us up, give us a turn to a heading of 120, effective final. Dial into 120, so you see that's going to be essentially a base turn. And hope before we get there, the ILS will come in and we'll fly it in. So I've switched over here. The ILS still has not been ID'd yet. Oh, now it's showing up down here, so it's probably going to pop up here in a moment. The HSI thinks it's there. The GPS just there's now the GPS has decoded the Morse code. It says ITTA, which is what so the nav has been identified. So we're going to fly this straight at this, and then ATC is going to give us the famous PTAC turn when we get close enough in. Now they've given us a turn to 060 to intercept the localizer, and said maintain 2,000. 2,100 feet to establish, so we're going to start our descent, dialing into vertical speed, so we hit BS, descending, also heading mode, we're still in heading mode, so I've turned to a 060 heading as we're descending. We can see we got the green indication here for our glide slope. That green means it's ILS, it's not GPS driven. So we're waiting for our ILS needles to come in. We also have indications up here, both lateral and vertical as well, for the lateral CDI and the vertical. Now our needles are coming in. We've also armed the approach mode, and again, this one does not stay in the heading mode. It should have stayed in heading until it was active a little closer in. And you would not see nav and approach. Normally this would just say approach. And you can see it's already in the approach mode. We're still descending down to our 2,100 feet. And in the real system, you're going to see VS, ALTS, and GS. This just doesn't show all three of those things showing off. Okay, so we're leveling off at 2,100 feet. So we've leveled off. Now you can see now it's showing the GS that should have been there before. The simulator just doesn't simulate it exactly correctly. So the glide slope is armed. We're in altitude hold mode at 2,100 feet. I'm just slowing down a little bit for the approach. You see our needles are in here. Glide slope still not quite in yet. Jumped ahead a little bit, now we can see our glide slope starting to come in here and up this one. You only have one glide slope indication on the G3X Touch. So you'd have it on the G3X Touch and on the G5 like you see here. So when this comes in, glide slope should become the active mode. Just waiting for that to become active. so we got a beep. Now we see our glide slope is the active mode. So it's gonna start down. I'm just powering down a little bit so I don't get too fast as it descends. So those of you that recognize our approaches, so we're right at heady right now, headed inbound. And I notice I don't have anything showing on the GPS for a track. We're strictly flying with the nav. I've intentionally left the altitude bug at 2,100 feet because that's the missed approach altitude, the missed approach hold. So we're now getting down, we're down to 900 feet. Once I get down, I would normally hit the go around. The go around does not work on our simulator. I'm going to kind of fake it out a little bit here. So we're going to power up, start our climb, and then re-engage lateral and vertical modes. So in the normal go around, you'd hit the go around button, power up. So there, that's where I hit the go around button. You see the autopilot disconnected. I just quickly re-engaged it. So I'm going to re-engage it in heading mode. Then I'm going to click on the indicated airspeed. I captured 93. So if you hit the go around button, it goes into pitch up 7 degrees, wings level. Then you reselect a lateral mode and a vertical mode. I'm going to climb this up. So this is climb to 1,300 and then turn back to ICTAL. I don't feel like we really need to continue on with this one. So I'm going to stop this one here and we'll move on to the next one. Anybody have any question on what that was? This is with no GPS guidance whatsoever. Strictly flying with VORs and ILS. Nobody has any questions on that. We'll move on to the next one. All right, so this one's a flight with GPS, heading, nav, and then fly the ILS. So we're going to execute more modes of the autopilot. So the flight plan, we're going to load in KTTA, Liberty, Merrill, back to KTTA. So we're going to depart runway 3. We're going to enter controlled airspace on heading of 350. And for some odd reason, the controller says intercept the course from Yuxie to Liberty, then as filed. Another nasty controller, 3,000, expect 4 in 10 minutes. Then we're going to ask for the full ILS Yankee 3 back into TTA. So this is what it's going to look like. We're going to take off, fly. Now this shows going to Yuxie, but I just put Yuxie in here so we could intercept this course. This is the heading. We're going to start flying. We're going to intercept this course line towards Liberty, and then we'll deviate off of that. And ATC messes with us a little bit in here. Oh, you can't see that. Sorry about that. So we're going to take off, fly this up to the course from Yuxie to Liberty. Then ATC is going to start giving us vectors down this way, and we have to deviate for some traffic. And then we'll go to ICTAL, fly the full procedure from ICTAL. Let me see if I can turn the volumes down. Is that turning my volume down? Okay.
Quick question. These
Sure.
fixes you're putting in up there, I know you're putting an arrow where they are, but did you program them in before the flight if you were in the airplane? I mean, how do they show up in flight?
This is pretty much exactly how I would do it. Now, when you see the arrow up there, I'm kind of doing that. I'm trying to put the arrow, what I'm touching as I'm doing it.
Okay.
So I build the flight plan. That's part of my pre-flight.
Okay.
As I load my flight plan in, if I know what it is. Occasionally that'll bite you. They'll change it after you call it, get your clearance, but I'll load it in. So I'm assuming I've got that clearance and I'll load that in. So I've been told to expect that to do that intercept. So that's why I put Yuxie in there. So I have that course line. Okay. All right. So I'm loading in the flight plan. I put Yuxie in there because we're never going to need that. So I told what our clearance was. So we're going to enter. So we're going to end up flying a heading when we take off. So the setup in the GTN was KTTA, Yuxie, Liberty, Merrill, TTA. Selected the default nav page. On the G5, I'm going to use the GFC 500 for heading to the runway heading. So I've set it for 030. We've set our target altitude of 3,000 feet because that's what we were told to fly initially. Again, the takeoff doesn't work, so we're departing. So we're going to do this a little more manually. So we're departing runway 3 as soon as we're off the ground. And I'm going to engage it too low, but we'll engage it anyway. So we're off the ground. We're not high enough to legally engage it, but this is a simulator, so we can play in the artificial world. So it engaged in roll and pitch mode. It's going to roll the wings back level. Yes, it should. And it should capture the pitch that we have there. Now we're going to switch to heading and indicated airspeed mode. So I'll switch both lateral and vertical. Now I'm going to dial the indicated airspeed up to a cruise climb of 87 knots. All right, so we're getting up close to controlled airspace, so we're going to turn to our heading of 350. So again, our active modes are heading, the autopilot's engaged, and we're climbing to 87 knots, and our altitude is selected, so it's going to climb to 3,000 feet and level off. So I tap on the flight plan bar over here. Brings up Yuxi, and I'm going to activate. Let me just back up here just a second. So you see that again. I click on the flight plan bar. I'm going to click Liberty, and I'm going to activate the leg from Yuxi to Liberty because we've been told to intercept that. So now we've activated that leg from Yuxi to Liberty. You see our course indication has changed down here. This is the course line now between Yuxi and Liberty. I'm still in heading mode, so I'm going to fly over and intercept that course line. So at this point, I would arm the nav mode, but it doesn't work quite right on the simulator. So at this point, I would have pressed nav mode. Heading would remain active. GPS would be in white over here to the left, and we would continue to fly this heading until the course line gets in closer, and then the nav mode would become active. So we've dialed in our next altitude of 4,000 feet because we know that's what we're expected. We haven't been told to climb yet. We haven't told how to get there, so it's just going to stay at 3,000. We're waiting for ATC to give us that climb. They're probably keeping us out of the traffic pattern at Raleigh-Durham. So now it's captured the nav mode, so it's in GPS for the lateral mode. So we're making our turn, and I always try to get people to keep their heading bug on their heading. So we're turning to this heading, so I want to get my heading bug around there because you never know when ATC may call you up and give you a turn to another heading. So our status bar now, we're navigating on the GPS course line, autopilot's engaged, and we're at 3,000 feet. Now ATC is going to clear us up to 4,000. So we've now selected indicated airspeed climb. That's indicated up here, and we've told it we want to climb at 90 knots, and our altitude is targeted 4,000. It flashed because we were within 1,000 feet of our target altitude. It will flash again when we're within 200 feet of our altitude. Now again, on the G3X Touch, you do not get this indication up here of the 90 knots. You only get the indicated airspeed that you've dialed in on the status bar on the G3X Touch. Okay, ATC's come up and told us to proceed direct to Merrill. So now on the autopilot, let me just back up a little bit there. So I clicked on, one more time. So I'm going to click on the status, the bar here, which is our mini flight plan. That will bring up the flight plan. I'm going to click on Merrill, and then I'm going to click the direct to button. Well, I'm showing you multiple ways to do that now. Sorry. I could do, this is different ways that you could do the same thing. That was one way, or you could click direct to, come in here, go to your flight plan, then select Merrill. Several ways you can do that. Then you would activate it. So I've activated direct to Merrill now. So we're still in nav mode. So our course line is now switched to direct to Merrill. So we can confirm that here. Sure. Okay, let me pause this. Okay, sure.
So halfway through, when you say direct to Merrill, can you keep the rest of the flight plan still in place?
Yeah, the question is, once I click direct to Merrill, is the rest of the flight plan still there? Yes, it is. This is just showing on this bar here, and you'll see this on the 750 as well at the bottom of the map page. It just says I'm direct to Merrill. It doesn't show me what the flight plan is over here before Merrill because I'm direct to Merrill, irregardless of what the rest of the flight plan showed. But if I were to click on this again and bring the flight plan up, the rest of it's still there. Okay.
So this is the same 650 that's there in the Skyhawk, right?
Yes, it is. It's the same 650 that's in the Skyhawks. Now, I will warn you, there are two variants of the 650 in our fleet. There's a 650 and a 650 XI. They are slightly different. They do operate ever so slightly different. So just be aware of which one you're flying.
So
This part is the same.
in the Skyhawks, there are two things.
Yes. Yep. So we have 650 and 650 XIs, and those are split in the Skyhawks and the Warriors. Okay, so we're now direct to Liberty, our active mode, GPS. We've now gone up. We've climbed to our 4,000 feet, and we're direct to Merrill. So we've sent our heading bug up to keep it there because we never know when ATC is going to give us a call to turn. All right, ACT has called us up and told us to turn left to 180. So since I already had the heading bug centered up, I could go ahead and click heading and then turn the knob to 180. That way I don't have to scroll to 180, then hit heading. I'm already in a current heading. I hit the heading button and then scroll the knob to 180. It immediately starts my turn. So they called us out, told us to turn that. There was traffic in the way. Now, in a minute, ATC is going to call us up and say, proceed direct to Merrill. Quickest way to do that, since Merrill is still our active waypoint, is to just click direct to and then click activate again. So you'll see that in just a moment. So another way to reactivate it, or I could have just clicked direct and just reactivate it. So our course line is now back direct to Merrill. So the plane, we've gone to nav mode, and the plane is making the turn back direct to Merrill. So again, I'm going to recenter my heading bug. And we make our request to ATC. We'd like the ILS and the TTA. So they tell us to expect that. So again, we're going to bring up our flight plan here in a minute. couple of ways you can do that. There's several ways you can bring up the approach procedure. That was one way. So you could touch procedure. You could also do it from the default nav page and then click on KTTA and load the procedure from there. That's my preferred way of doing it. And then click approach. And we're going to load the ILS Yankee 3. And we're going to select ICTAL as the transition. And I'm just going to load the approach because we're still direct to Merrill. They've not cleared us for it yet. So we can scroll through and make sure all the waypoints are there that we expect, that we've got the right approach loaded. So I'll go back to my default nav page. Nothing changes, just loaded our procedure into the flight plan. And on the set GTNs, it always puts the approach procedure at the end of your flight plan. So I'm going to, checking over here, I'm going to toggle in my ILS frequency. When you load the procedure, it loads the ILS frequency into standby. It does not put it on the active side. You have to toggle it into the active side. All right, so then it clears for the approach. So we're going to scroll down to our flight plan. So there's the approach. I could activate it that way. And here's another way. I could go to procedure, activate the approach that way. Or I could scroll down to the flight plan, click on ICTAL, and tell it to go direct to ICTAL. That also activates the flight plan. Activates the approach. So we're now direct to ICTAL. So our course line has changed. The plane, since we were in nav mode, is going to immediately start to make that turn towards ICTAL. And they've cleared us for the approach. We're within 30 miles. So if you look at that approach plate, that means we can descend to 3,200 feet. So I'm going to take my altitude select button here and I'm going to scroll this number down to 3,200 feet. And then I've selected VS, so it captured 0. I'm going to thumb it down with my nose trim here. I've only trimmed it down to 200 feet a minute. But I got a pretty good ways. I got 17 miles to, and so I'm in no hurry to get down. So, and I've got a little impatient, so I dialed it up to 300 feet a minute descent. I still don't have my ILS frequency identified yet, so the nav aid's not identified. Well, now we hear it. So it should pop up on the GTN 650 momentarily once it decodes it. We've now captured our 3,200 feet. We're still in nav mode for the GPS. So we're still navigating there. You can fly the procedure turn with the nav mode. You could go ahead and activate the approach mode. So once we're in, so I've already dialed it down to 2,100 feet. Once this is below 10 miles, I can descend to 2,100 feet. But again, we're holding 32. I haven't told it how to get down yet. So now we've passed the 10 miles. I hit the VS button. Again, I've thumbed it down to 300 feet descent at this point. My altitude select is set for 2,100 feet. So it's going to ascend to 2,100 feet and level off. So at this point, I've activated the approach mode. The bar up here is not quite accurate again. It should show localizer, GPS, approach, altitude, VS, ALTS, and GS. And the simulator is not quite right. I'm checking that my hold's in there for the hold in lieu of procedure turn. And you can see it here as well, so you can see the holds there. I can visualize it on the map page. And you can see if you look at the map, looks like it's going to tell us a teardrop. It actually will tell us it's going to recommend a teardrop down here. So now you can see that it looks like a teardrop in here. You can see by the little white arrows around the circle there, or around the hold. One thing I do want you to notice once we cross the ICTAL and start proceeding outbound is look at this lateral CDI versus the HSI. And this is true on the G3X Touch. You'll have a lateral CDI at the top, and you also have the HSI at the bottom on the G3X Touch, and you will see the same thing on that as well. All right, so we've crossed ICTAL. The HSI is now flipped to the inbound leg. We're now going to be flying out this way to make the turn. You see the HSI starting to move this way to your right, but the lateral CDI is moving to the left. I've had more than one person get confused what's happening with that. It's telling you exactly the same information. It's just being displayed different because this is HSI and rotates your current track here relative to the inbound track. This is assuming you're on the heading of your inbound track. So if I were on a heading of 030, that course line would be off to the left.
The system knows to follow this track for the procedure turn.
So the question is, the system knows to follow that track. Correct, it does. This is different than if you're flying the 172s. This is true for the Warriors and the Moonies. It will do this because it's smart enough. It's talking to the GPS. It says, oh, I know I'm not supposed to turn inbound. It's essentially doing GPS steering. On the 172s, you can fake that autopilot out by using a GPS steering mode on the G5. You put it in GPS steering mode, it fakes out the autopilot. You put the autopilot in heading mode on the 172s, but on these you don't have to do that. It's smart enough to talk to the GPS directly.
And if you had a strong wind that was coming off your left forward, it's still going to apply the track to compensate for the wind.
I have seen it try to compensate some for the winds. It usually does not do it sufficiently. So it may compensate a bit going out. You may see the track go out wider, but I've had it where it goes through the inbound course because of the winds. It just doesn't do it very well, from what I've seen. Hans, you?
Yeah, I see that occasionally, but once you establish on the inbound course, it will intercept and track it.
Yeah, even if it overshoots the inbound turn because of the winds, it will intercept and track. I have seen it where it looks like it's trying to compensate on this hold and lieu procedure turn. It just doesn't seem to do a good job of it.
I've seen it where it selects a different heading.
Yes.
Teardrop That I would select. in
Yes.
that situation. So it's doing something.
Yes. So it's now telling us to turn inbound. Now we're not turning inbound. The plane's in GPS mode. It's in approach mode, so it's turning inbound. I'm just going ahead and turning the heading bug around to my inbound course line. Now things will start to make a little more sense once I'm inbound. This is going to agree with my lateral one up here. So this is one time I really like the map page for situational awareness. Otherwise, I tend to like the default nav. On the 750, that's not a big deal because you only have the map page. There is no default nav because you have all the other information you need on the map page as well. This is also a time on the G3X Touch. You may want to bring up the flight plan on this right-hand half of the G3X Touch. I'm sorry, the approach plate, not the map, the approach plate. So we're turning inbound. You see this now makes a little sense. It's off to our left. This is a little off to our left, so things are lining up. It's getting on the inbound course line. So I'm going back to the default nav page that I like on the 650. So we're still an altitude hold at 2,100 feet. We're 0.3 miles from ICTAL. Once we pass ICTAL, if I need to stay in the hold, I would press suspend. It would stay in the hold, just keep looping around. We're going to let it proceed past that. Once we pass ICTAL, it should automatically select the ILS. So you see it automatically switch to VLOC. Let me pause here. There are a couple of things that go a little crazy on this, on the simulator, not in the real plane, thankfully. So it automatically switched to VLOC. I didn't make that change. In the real plane, your course line here automatically slews to the inbound course line. So it would be automatically set to 030. The simulator doesn't do that. So you're going to see me change this course line. That doesn't happen in the real plane. This is an anomaly with the simulator. The other thing you'll see is it now says localizer is active and glide slope is active, but we're nowhere close to the glide slope intercept yet. So what it starts to do is start to artificially climb to try to go back and capture that glide slope. So what I have to do is disengage the approach mode and re-engage it. Again, that's an anomaly on the simulator. Doesn't do it in the real plane. Just be aware that's what's going on here. Just, okay, Heinz says that's fixed now. Okay, there's been a software update since I did this. This was done over a year ago, so. All right, Heinz says that part's fixed on the simulator. So that's one reason you see things going a little wonky up here with the pitch. Now you'll see me go change the course to 030 or 029. I'm not sure what I picked. Just got it close because I was in momentary panic mode on the simulator. And now you see it starting to climb and I'm slowing down because it's pitching up. It took me a little bit to realize that's what it was doing. It's because it had already made the glide slope the active mode. You're going to see me make some changes here. And this will come back to be a little more what it should be. Because again, I'm not at heady yet. Glide slope is still well above me. We are seeing the localizer 1 indication here. That's kind of what I was pointing out with my cursor over there. You can see I still hadn't realized it was climbing yet. I'm a little dense sometime. I finally realized it when I heard the beep. So I reselected altitude select and I scroll it back down to 2,100 feet. And I collected VS to said, get back down to 2,100 feet, which is where I'm supposed to be. And then I rearmed the approach mode. Again, you don't see the armed glide slope yet. Again, this is, I'm not sure if that's been fixed yet or not. You would see it on the regular one. You would not see the -300. You'd see VS, ALTS, and GS. Have they fixed the go-around thing? Oh, and Heinz says they fixed the go-around as well, so I guess I need to update my videos. All right, so it's now back down to 2,100 feet. We're just gonna cruise along, so we got another 1.5 miles to heady. I don't remember if I skipped forward or not. I wanna skip past it. I want you to see the glide slope intercept. So now I've re-engaged the approach mode. So now you see, or it's captured the 2,100. Now the glide slope is the armed mode. Because it's an ILS, this will say GS, not GP. So the glide slope's just about in on both of these, as it should be. Now the plane's starting to pitch down. The glide slope is now the active mode on the autopilot in the vertical mode. So I just use the throttles to control my airspeed. It's going to control the pitch to stay on the glide path. So I'm now controlling the airspeed with my throttles. And I get a beep when I get past. Again, I just went out of 200 feet from the 2,100 feet. That's why it beeped and flashed. Again, I leave the 2,100 in. I don't dial in my decision altitude or MDA. I leave that as my I'll leave that in as my target altitude because that's what I want on the miss. So we're down almost to DA. And I'm going to hit the go around button that just disconnects the autopilot. Heinz says that part's fixed. We're going to start our climb out. I'll re-engage the autopilot and then I'll select a lateral and vertical mode. So I've just re-engaged the autopilot. I've quickly selected heading and I've selected indicated airspeed, and I'm going to dial it back for my climb out. So this says I'm arriving at the waypoint. That's the missed approach. I'm going to activate the GPS miss. I'm going to re-engage the nav mode. So I'm in GPS. Altitude is selected to 2100. It's going to continue to climb at 80 knots. And it's going to stay on this heading until I get to 1300 feet. Once this gets to 1300 feet, it's going to automatically start that left turn back to ICTAL. So it says, all right, I'm at 1300 feet. I'm now going to tell you to turn left. You'll see it automatically. So it changed my course line back to ICTAL, and the autopilot starting and roll us to the left to make that climbing left turn. I've just zoomed in here so you can see this is the course line that it's going to keep us on. So this course deviation is assuming this as my path. So it's doing, it knows I can't instantly turn. So it's saying, oh, you're just going to make a gradual turn back to ICTAL. That's why this needle stays centered, because that's the path it's expecting me to fly. And you can see it banked over to a standard rate turn. Okay. And it'll take that as fly us back out to ICTAL, and it would just get into hold, and it would just stay there and fly into hold until we told it something else we wanted to do. Okay. Yes, so the comment is the desired track and track are so different, but the HSI needle stayed centered. The desired track is the track directly back out to it, but it knows we're turning to go back to it. So it's smart enough to realize, oh, that's not the court. I really don't want to be on 206 yet. I can't snap roll it back over that way. I'm making a gradual turnaround to it. Okay.
A question about the turn rate. So it's here doing this approach and the miss, and it's going to do a standard rate turn.
That's correct.
But if
Well,
you're
okay, let me back up just a moment.
okay,
The Warrior sometimes banks over a little more abruptly than you might expect it to.
mhm.
You will see it sometimes command a 30-degree bank. I've seen it go a little steeper than that. It should only command a 30-degree. On this one, since it's a gradual roll in, it's just going to roll to a standard rate turn.
Will the Warriors do that 30-degree stuff when it's doing an approach?
I
thought maybe there'd be a difference between approach mode versus just flying, out en route.
No, I have seen it command. In fact, the first time I flew the Warriors with one of these was in the real clouds on the bringing it back. And I had to do the procedure turn at ICTAL. In the first turn, it banked it over to 30 degrees and almost disconnected until I saw it recover back.
Yeah.
So it can command. Remember, those command limits for the autopilot is plus or minus 30 degrees. It will eventually settle down to a standard rate turn, except under one condition. If the winds are severe enough, it will bank more than the standard rate bank angle to try to keep a standard rate turn. So it may bank over a little steeper if it needs to because of winds. I have seen that happen.
Okay, thank you.
This behavior of the CDI in the turn, does that happen in the Skyhawk also?
I'm sorry, you're talking about when you pass ICTAL outbound?
No, when we are in the turn, it realizes that you shouldn't immediately. So the CDI, right?
Yes.
That
You're talking about the HSI here?
Yes. It knows that you're gradually going through that heading, so it doesn't show you out of whack, right? Is that
Correct. I believe that is correct in those Skyhawks as well.
CDI does not represent the design track.
Well,
Doesn't really matter.
okay. This heading is correct. It's just saying, I know it's going to take you a bit to get there, so I don't want you to try to go over there and capture something too abruptly. It's saying you're doing the right thing. You're going around that arc just the way I expected you to, and that's coming from the GPS.
Right, but every other turn I can think about holding pattern. When you go into a holding pattern in lieu of, it switches to the inbound course, it's the desired track. But the CDI does not represents instantly that desired track, the inbound course.
Right.
So that's the same thing.
Yes, so there is a little inconsistency here when you're doing the hold in lieu of versus the miss. And I don't know if that's a certification thing that they have to show you it that way on the approach. I don't know.
So
All right, so now we're going to do the last approach here. This is going to be the RNAV 21 back into TTA. We're just going to be approaching gusses from the west. So we're going to be arriving from the west to TTA at 5,000 feet. ATC is going to tell us to proceed direct to Ozope and tell us to cross Ozope at or above 3,100 feet. I think I got this written in here. Get my cursor at the right place. So we're coming in from the west at 5,000. We request the RNAV 21 from Ozope with the step downs. So they're going to clear us to Ozope at above 3,100 feet, and then we're cleared for the RNAV 21. We're going to set up the G10 to fly the approach. So the approach is going to be loaded, and we're going to activate direct to Ozope. And again, we'll be doing this with the autopilot. So I'll try to walk us through this one as well. All right, so we've got the approach loaded. We're direct to Ozope, but we're at 5,000 feet. Well, I'm sorry, we got this direct Ozope as active, but we're in heading mode. So I'm just verifying my altitudes and that I've got the right approach loaded. Go back to my default nav. So we're 6.7 miles from Ozope. But we're still on the heading. ATC's not cleared us for it yet. They haven't told us to turn direct to it. So now they've told us to proceed direct to Ozope, cross at or above 3,100 feet. So I've dialed into 3,100 feet. I'm going to start my descent. Turns out this heading is pretty much taking us direct to Ozope, so I haven't been too active, too aggressive at hitting the nav mode yet. So my active mode is heading, approach, we're descending. I've dialed it down to 700 feet per minute because we're not that far from Ozope, and I just wanted to get down. I'm going to change this a little bit and slow it down so it doesn't descend quite as fast, so you can see what happens there. So I've now already armed the approach. Again, you don't see GS out here. It's not displayed correctly. This should be GPS, AP, VS, ALTS, and GP displayed at the top. So I'm only 0.6 miles from Ozope. I'm still at 3,600 feet. So it's now going to start our turn. It's telling us to make that right turn to heading of 149. And it's just going to keep ascending. So this is now flipped over. You see the HSI stays centered because it knows I'm turning. Kind of what we were talking about. It's doing that turn anticipation, and we're staying on the arc line flying in. So I've changed the vertical speed that I've requested to 400 feet a minute. I've recentered my heading bug. All right, I jumped forward a little bit. So we're now from Ozope to Yuxie. We've turned inbound. We're descending down to 2,200 feet. Actually, we're at 2,200 feet. Our glide path is armed. So now it's showing correctly. We are holding at 2,200. Let's see, I think I dial it down to 2,000. Yeah. So I'm going to dial this down. All right, now we started to turn. Sorry, I spoke a little too quickly. So at Yuxie, we're turning inbound, not Ozope. My bad. So we've now reached Yuxie. We're turning inbound. We're at 2,200. I've now dialed it down to 2,000. I've told it to descend at 300 feet a minute as we make that inbound turn to Wisney. Again, we've lost the glide path indication up here because this one tends to show you the VS down. The real one doesn't. It would say VS, ALTS, and GP. And the ALTS and GP would be in white. Once this captured 2000, you'll see the GP in white show up again. So now it's captured the altitude, 2,000 feet. So that's what it's saying here. And now we see our glide path is armed. So I'm just double checking that my approach is loaded correctly. That's why you see me scrolling around over here. All the waypoints are what I expect. Now I go back to my default nav page and I look at the map just for fun, back to default nav. So we're 1.6 miles from Wisney. Notice now our glide path, both of them are magenta. That means it's a GPS glide path, not a localizer glide path. Confirming all my statuses. We're GPS, autopilot's engaged, we're at altitude hold, and our glide path is armed. And again, we're controlling the airspeed with our throttle. So we're approaching Wisney. You see the glide slope coming in, or the glide path coming in. So we're 0.2 miles from Wisney. It's going to capture the glide path. And you see now it's captured the glide path. And so it's going to start the descent down. And you hear me reduce the throttle a little bit so I don't get too fast as I start that descent down. Okay. And it just flies this down, fly it down to DA, disconnect, and then go in and land. So I don't think you want to, and I actually stopped the simulation before I land because I cannot land the simulator and I was embarrassed to show it. So we'll stop it here. That's the last of the simulations I had for you. Anybody have any questions on that one?
George can teach you how to land the sim.
Yeah, I'm terrible. I'm terrible landing the simulator. Anybody have any questions in the chat room or in here? Everybody is asleep. It is being recorded and it will be posted up on the Wings of Carolina YouTube channel, I believe. And the last one we did was also recorded. Took me a while to get that edited, but that should also be up on the Wings of Carolina YouTube channel.
You know, it's interesting for me just looking at this. It's very similar to what's in the 7.5, 7.6, and 787 that United flies. The difference is, big difference is the auto throttle. It's like I noticed when you're having to change altitudes and wait for glide path. When we hit approach, once we're in and we're clear for the approach, we just hit approach, and then the speed is set, which is either set in the box in the FMC or the motor control panel up here. Either way, and then you configure all this, and when it captures the glide path, it's done.
Yeah. So what Tom is saying there's some similarities between this and some of the big iron. One of the differences is we don't have auto throttles. And you'll see that people learning to fly this, they'll start, particularly if they're doing a long descent, they recognize I got to throttle back so I don't get too fast. What they forget is once it levels out, when they've descended down and they're leveling off, they'll forget to add the throttles back in because they get busy doing something else and the airspeed starts to bleed off and bleed off and bleed off because the airplane's trying to hold the altitude. And at least now it won't take you to a stall. You'll start to get that underspeed warning that they talked about in the ESP thing, and then it will sacrifice altitude to keep you from stalling. But you are responsible. I tell people, look, autopilot's doing most of the work for you. You work the rudders, the throttle, and the mixture. Come on, at least you can do that. So yeah, you do have to remember to do that.
I worry about people, however, who have not learned to hand fly and understand the aerodynamics of power for altitude
Right.
and angle of attack for airspeed.
So what George is talking about, he's just worried about people relying on the automation, not to understand the fundamentals of flying, that you pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. And I absolutely agree with that. You need to understand it. Part of it for me with the autopilot is, all right, if it starts to level off, I need to do something to anticipate that it's leveling off and reduce the power some. Or on a climb, or else it's going to start to, because it's reacting to what I do, I'm reacting to what it does. I need to anticipate what it's going to do a little bit, so I know how to work the throttles. Anybody else have any other questions? Anybody in the chat?
Yeah, I have a question. If you're flying ILS with this thing, with this autopilot, let's say you're flying ILS and the system's fully functional. What happens if you lose vertical guidance during the approach? What will the thing do? It's going to light up a red X on the vertical guidance deviation indicator. Is it, what's it going to do to the airplane in terms of controlling the airplane?
Your glide path is going to go away. If it doesn't have a valid glide path,
Does it
if you're in the
pitch
middle,
level?
I'd probably just, I'm going to guess, I'd have to look at the, again, look at the AFMS for it. I've not looked at that particular one. We talked about it earlier. I don't know if it would go to pitch, or I think it probably would do pitch, but their recommendation would probably be to disengage and go miss.
Right.
Or do a localizer minimums.
Yeah, or if you have enough time, depending on where it fails on you, you can just transition to a localizer and just do it the
Oh, sure.
old-fashioned way.
If
Yeah.
you're proficient enough to reselect modes on the autopilot when you probably haven't figured out what actually happened, great, go
Yep.
for it.
Yep.
Otherwise, get out, come back around, figure it
Yeah.
out when you got a little more time.
Yep. Yep. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, this was good. Thanks.
Anybody else?
So that should be element of training emphasis is that you've gotta drill about managing the throttle yourself, right? I mean,
Sure.
if you, I mean, that's really gotta be.
And I think people who learn the basics of aerodynamics a long time ago won't have a problem. People who look at it, it's just a video game. That's something.
That,
Be my guess, you guys know better than
that San Francisco accident that happened in 2013 is a classic example where the guy was the captain in Asiana, was so used to the fully automated system. And then when he did not have a fully automated system, he forgot that the auto throttle weren't gonna do the job for him at the right places. And he got so enamored with picking a pitch mode to get back down because he wasn't used to no ILS and he had not kept up with things. So when he did that, he completely forgot that, the throttles were here and he didn't pay attention to them. And none of the other guys, of course, said anything, but that's what happened.
Right.
Is the
Well,
airplane, he got back down toward the glide path eventually, but his energy state was horrible because the airspeed had no throttle movement and the throttles were back at idle.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely have to stay engaged with the flight. I mean, and it's, to me, the pilot's role changes a little bit. It's a lot more monitoring to make sure you know what the system's doing, what you expect it to do, so you can know that's not what it should do. If it's not doing what you expect, turn it off, then figure it out. Don't keep mucking around with it, trying to figure out why is it doing that. So yeah, you've got to stay actively involved. The horror stories I hear are people on autopilot reading a book or something like, no.
Okay.
You got to stay involved with the aircraft. So